What a gift to stand at the back of that chapel today and watch the procession that came in the door. I'm humbled by the learning and the growing that I have done here with you this year, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to preach today. Thank you to the ways the community has just been holding the worship services this week. I feel like we've been fed all week with Reverend Job on Tuesday, Dr. Cooper yesterday, and we just pray for God's leading and guidance in our service today. Thank you. Thank you. I came to the chapel last Friday to stand right here in this spot. More than one person had told me that I should stand in the pulpit before preaching here because word on the street is that it's a hard place to preach. There's echoes you can't control, and the pulpit's a little tight, folks say, and the community of the faithful is so far away. But those aren't the only reasons it's hard. In his collection of Duke Chapel sermons, Bishop Willimon speaks to the greater challenges of preaching in a place where tradition hangs so heavy in the air, and where pastoral care is so hard to forge, and where the architecture is so grand it can almost distract a preacher from the compromises curled in the corners. There's echoes you can't control. The pulpit's a little tight, and the faithful community seems far away. This spring I've been looking for faithful community. Places strong enough, pure enough to belie the fear in my belly that our church, Christ's church, is broken. I wanted a tradition untainted by racist ugliness, free from the indignations of petty bureaucracy, fearless in self-denial, bold in proclamation. I wanted an assurance of things I could not see. But tradition is tricky business. I'm a preacher, so when I hear Hebrews 11, I recognize a fellow sojourner that's hit pay dirt. Yep. It's fun to read, the rhythm of it and the repetition of it and the rising pitch and the quickened pace. By faith, the preacher says, by faith, like flying buttresses in a cathedral of words, a cathedral so high that you feel small under the weight of so much memory, surrounded by clouds of stained glass stories. Those, the preacher says, of whom the world was not worthy. Can you imagine a more beautiful ode to tradition? And yet even here, even as I sit small inside this text, the protest in my heart grows. See, I know these stories too well. They're more than pious faces posed in colored light. They have issues. All of them have issues. Complicit Gideon, fearful Barak, violent Samson. Time would fail to tell. And then there's the name that drops like a stone in my stomach. Jephthah, who sacrifices his daughter because of a poorly worded vow. A man who won't trust God with his weakness and his mistake, whose need for self-justification, whose need to be right, stops the beating heart of the next generation. I don't call that faith. And yet here he stands, honored alongside Abraham and Moses and Rahab, who, for my money, is his better by far. And more to the point, here stands this Hebrews preacher, this preacher that I trusted, this preacher that I thought I had something in common with, justifying him. I want Jephthah out of the litany. He doesn't belong. I want to cut him out of the text. Just take my safety scissors and go to town, get rid of Barak while I'm at it, get rid of Samson until we've got a whole snowflake of holes in that piece of paper. I want a tradition to be proud of because I'm tired of standing on muddy ground. It's a hard place to preach. I'll bet there's a few of you who are tired of standing in muddy ground too. Preaching in churches with their own complicit leaders and their own lovers of violence and their own Jephthahs. Churches who think the subject of gun violence is too provocative, particularly when it comes to the death of a black boy. Churches who tell a young man called to ministry that he sounds too gay in the pulpit. Churches who fear undocumented caravans enough to close the borders of their hearts and slam shut the doors of their churches. And yet here's my confession. The thing that I know deep down that I don't want to admit. My desire to snip that tradition into a pattern of my own liking is not so different from the desires I just described. Those who fight to protect the church's status quo. Those desires are two sides of the same coin. Because for both, tradition, whether it's its protection or its purification, is the point of faith. And I don't think that's the point of this Hebrews passage at all. I want you to pay attention with me for a minute to the verb tenses in our Hebrews text today. Past tense, all the way down through Hebrews 11, conquered, administered, quenched, just like we would expect. I mean, that's where history belongs, in the past, right? But something happens at the start of Hebrews 12. The verbs crash into the present. We are surrounded by so great a cloud, it says. A cloud of persons who have not simply witnessed unfulfilled promise, but are witnesses of a present reality. There's a logic of resurrection that undergirds this entire Hebrews passage. And this logic of resurrection upends the entire character and purpose of Christian history. What difference does the resurrection make to Christian tradition? That's my question this morning. And sometimes plain and simple speech is best. So I brought 3 points with me today. First, resurrection means tradition lives. It means those figures who failed so greatly and at times shone so bright, they're not frozen in the past. They're actively witnessing in the present. According to the preacher, they're here with us right now. Now, what do you think they're saying, crowded up there in the rafters? What do you think Jephthah says after thousands of years of listening to God's people? After facing his daughter, after coming face to face with a God who was willing to go to such great lengths to show that no child need ever be sacrificed again. You think he's up there going, follow me, imitate me, do what I did? Or is he saying, don't look to me, look to him. There was a God bigger than I ever understood. Love you, children. I don't have to tell you that at Duke Divinity School, we've been asking a lot of questions right now about tradition. What does our past mean for our future? How do we chart a course in times of transition? It's been some spirited discussion. Sometimes the discussion was more spirited than one would like. But you know what I'll bet? I'll bet if you asked the best and brightest of Duke's past, if you asked our heroes of the faith who we should be going forward, I'll bet you $1 to a donut that they don't say, follow me, imitate me, recreate our storied past. I bet their books are worth the paper they're printed on. They're saying, follow Jesus. Turn your eyes to Jesus. Do what he says. Go where he goes. It's the only thing that matters in the world. Resurrection means that Christian tradition was never meant to be about the imitation of some perfect past. Christian tradition witnesses to the one who's greater than all of us, the one whose sandals not a one of us is worthy to tie. Which brings me to my second point. Resurrection means that tradition moves. There's a linearity in this passage, a purpose, a goal, because the logic of resurrection begins and ends with a resurrected one. In the words of Douglas Campbell, it's all about Jesus, the pioneer, the perfecter, the resurrected Lord, who by the power of the Spirit is revealed in and through text and tradition, but is never reducible to either one. He stands apart. Hebrews 13 says, outside the camp. Even as he calls us to himself, even as he says, follow me, which means we move because he moves, even when it causes disagreement, even when it causes discomfort, even when it's risky and the road ahead is unclear. He's going ahead of us, which means tradition cannot stand still. And we have to be honest that that costs us something. It requires that tradition lay down the maintenance of a serene and familiar present as its primary goal. We are not called in Hebrews to a sort of cloudy stasis, which is why I think in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells us straight up that division is the cost of having him around. I'll tell you, that passage was the last thing I wanted to hear. It was the lectionary pairing for Hebrews. It seemed to unravel all these epic biblical themes of unity and forgiveness. But to be clear, I don't think Jesus has given us a free pass to be unloving. I think he's saying that there's more to discipleship than keeping the peace. That there's more to love than getting along. That there's more to the living out of this tradition than protecting the family. Because so often we define the family far too small. And we get far too settled in one place. In a very different season of my life, I was privileged to be part of Patricia Lowry's play, Dear Harvey, which celebrates the life and impact of Harvey Milk, the U.S.'s first openly gay elected official. The show had a composer named Thomas, who was just a college student at the time. He told the story that he was 19 when he was first verbally and physically threatened for being gay. He was scared. And then he got mad. But he just learned about milk, and something made him take action. He wrote to state officials every day, mind you, about the importance of LGBT history in schools. He raised $400 for LGBT education by throwing a gender-bending party at his dorm. And then he led a candlelight march to a local supermarket in drag on a Saturday night. Thomas doesn't call himself a Christian. At least he didn't last time we spoke of it. And Harvey Milk would be the first to tell you he's no Jesus. But this is my point. There is a Jesus. And he did not come and die and rise again for the purpose of our staying put. Our huddling in some holy, homogeneous huddle. He came to lead us to family, to love, to promise that requires that we move. Resurrection means that the goal of Christian tradition is following a living Lord wherever, however he leads. Point 3. Resurrection means that tradition hopes. It was a Thursday chapel service less than a month ago. There was excitement in the room because most of the folks there knew that a gift was about to be presented to one Reverend Dr. William C. Turner. A Hammond organ schemed over for months by a small band of committed faculty and students who knew that Christian tradition was not a singular noun. More than this, they knew that musical traditions matter. And so money had been raised and trucks had been driven. And organ specialists consulted for this unveiling, and there was great joy in the surprise. Such gratitude for a life that has lived and moved and witnessed to the resurrection in Duke Divinity School for decades. And then the gospel choir started to sing. When the saints begin to worship. And that organ began to play. Were you there? Were you there? I don't know what it was like where you were sitting. But I was sitting at the back. And around me, it was like something shifted in the room. Some sweet, sanctified reality broke through. And people began to cry. I mean, weep. Men, women, both. And then people started to laugh. Like those who dream, in the words of Psalm 126. The disbelieving laughter of those who can't believe how good and pleasant this is, how good God is. And no one wanted to stop singing, and no one wanted to stop worshiping, and nobody wanted to stop weeping, nobody wanted to stop shouting. Poor Dontavius, he could barely get us to sit down. I won't explain what happened in that room. It's not my place, it's not my desire to explain it. But I'll borrow words from Dr. Fulkerson to describe it. It was as if a wound of obliviousness became a place of appearing. For Calvin, this table was a place where space bends, and we ascend by the power of the Spirit, lifted into a throne room that we have no human business being in. Douglas Farrow does Calvin one better. The table, he argues, isn't just a place where space bends, it's also a place where time bends. And where we taste the great and glorious day of the Lord, when our pioneer and perfecter descends to us, right into this muddy ground of his church. Clouds at his feet, like a caravan coming full of men and women who don't have the right documents to preach, whose face will never be memorialized in glass. Saints cross-dressing in clothes of righteousness and grace. Our Jesus comes into this crazy, struggling, divided, beautiful human tradition. and makes this place, this year, this sanctuary, this community, a place of redemption. For those of you today who need to believe in the church again, turn your eyes to Jesus, the one who descends into broken churches when they least expect it and speaks with echoes we can't control and tightens pulpits like belts of truth around our waist and introduces us to the faithful from far away, from different spaces and different times across the whole expanse of history, people we never thought would be family. See, Jesus hasn't given up on the church. Just like he hasn't given up on you. He's the resurrection, and he's the life. And he descends even now. You do what he says. You go where he goes. It's the only thing that matters in the world. Amen.